The storm outside was a living thing, howling through the trees like a wounded beast, its breath rattling the windows of the old cabin. Rain lashed against the glass in erratic bursts, each droplet a tiny explosion of sound that echoed in the hollow spaces of the room. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the faint, lingering aroma of pine from the fire that had died hours ago. The only light came from a single flickering lantern, its golden glow casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, insignificant, as if the world outside had swallowed everything whole and left only this fragile pocket of warmth and light. Elliot sat cross-legged on the threadbare rug in front of the fireplace, a half-empty mug of tea cooling in his hands. He was a man of quiet habits, the kind of person who found comfort in routine and solitude. His life was a carefully curated collection of small, manageable things. The books stacked neatly on the shelves, the worn leather journal he wrote in every evening, the steady rhythm of his days spent working remotely as a freelance editor. He had come to the cabin to escape the noise of the city, to find some semblance of peace in the quiet of the woods. But tonight, the storm had other plans. He glanced at the clock on the mantel, 11:47 p.m. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the cabin into darkness and cutting off his only connection to the outside world. His phone lay useless on the table, its battery dead, and the landline had been silent for days. He was alone, utterly and completely, and for the first time in a long while he felt the weight of that solitude pressing down on him. Elliot wasn't sure what made him look up when he did. Perhaps it was the faintest shift in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of the storm. Or maybe it was something deeper, some primal instinct that whispered a warning in the back of his mind. Whatever it was, he turned his head toward the window, just in time to see a flash of light, bright and blinding, like a bolt of lightning, but somehow different. It illuminated the room for a split second, casting everything in stark relief before vanishing as quickly as it had come. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the storm. But then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a soft, almost melodic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was faint, barely audible over the roar of the wind, but it was there, threading through the chaos like a single, unbroken note. Elliot set his mug down slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, and moved toward the window. The glass was cold against his palm as he pressed his hand to it, peering out into the darkness. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the trees swaying violently in the wind. He squinted, trying to make out anything beyond the veil of water, but the night was impenetrable. And then he saw it, a figure, barely visible through the rain, moving toward the cabin. It was tall and slender, its movements fluid and almost otherworldly. Elliot's first thought was that it was a person, someone lost in the storm, but as the figure drew closer, he realized that wasn't quite right. There was something off about the way it moved, something that made his skin crawl and his stomach twist with unease. He took a step back from the window, his mind racing. What should he do? Open the door? Hide? His instincts screamed at him to lock the doors, to barricade himself inside, but another part of him, a quieter, more curious part, wanted to see, to understand. Before he could decide, the figure was at the door, its presence looming on the other side of the wood. The knock, when it came, was soft, almost tentative. It was the kind of knock that might have gone unnoticed if not for the tension in the air, the way it seemed to reverberate through the cabin. Elliot's hand hovered over the doorknob, his pulse thundering in his ears. He told himself to be rational, to think this through, but his body moved before his mind could catch up. The door creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight before him. The creature, because that was the only word that fit, was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were impossibly delicate, almost ethereal. Its skin was a pale, shimmering silver, like moonlight given form. And its eyes were vast and luminous, filled with swirling colors that seemed to shift and change with every passing second. It was beautiful in a way that was almost painful to look at, and yet there was something undeniably alien about it, something that set every nerve in Elliot's body on edge. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. And then the creature spoke, its voice a soft, melodic hum that resonated deep within Elliot's chest. "I mean you no harm," it said, the words flowing like water, smooth and effortless. "I am lost. The storm. It is not safe for me out there." Elliot's mind reeled. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What are you? Where did you come from? But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, stepping aside to let the creature in. As it moved past him, he caught a faint, almost floral scent, something light and sweet that lingered in the air. The creature paused in the center of the room, its gaze sweeping over the space with a curious intensity. It seemed to take in every detail, from the books on the shelves to the dying embers in the fireplace. And then it turned to Elliot, its eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "Thank you," it said simply, and there was something in its voice, something that made Elliot's cheeks flush with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, the world had shifted, tilting on its axis. Elliot didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same. The storm's fury seemed to grow louder, as if the wind and rain were conspiring to drown out the strange, otherworldly presence that had entered Elliot's cabin. The creature, Elliot still couldn't bring himself to think of it as anything else, stood in the center of the room, its luminous eyes scanning the space with an unsettling curiosity. It moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, its silver skin catching the flickering light of the lantern and scattering it in faint, iridescent patterns across the walls. Elliot closed the door slowly, his hand trembling on the knob. He turned to face the creature, his mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. "Who? What are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head, a gesture that was almost human, but not quite. "I am called Lyra," it said, its voice melodic and soothing, yet carrying an undercurrent of something Elliot couldn't quite place. "I come from a place far from here, a place your kind does not know." Elliot's chest tightened. "Are you an alien?" The word felt absurd as soon as it left his lips, but what else could it be? Lyra's appearance, her voice, her very presence defied any rational explanation. Lyra's lips, if they could be called that, curved into something resembling a smile. "In your terms, yes. But I am not here to harm you. I am stranded. My ship was damaged in the storm. I need shelter and time to repair it." Elliot's mind raced. An alien, an actual alien, standing in his cabin, asking for help. He felt a strange mix of awe and terror, the kind of feeling that made his stomach churn and his palms sweat. He wanted to believe her, to trust that she meant no harm, but the rational part of his brain screamed at him to be cautious. This was too much, too strange, too impossible. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" he asked, his voice firmer now, though his heart still pounded in his chest. "How do I know you're not? I don't know, here to invade or something?" Lyra's expression softened, and she took a step closer to him. Elliot instinctively took a step back, his back pressing against the door. "I understand your fear," she said gently, "but I am not your enemy. I am alone, just as you are, and I need your help." Her words struck a chord in him, though he couldn't quite explain why. There was something in her voice, something that made him want to believe her, to trust her. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by a blinding flash of light that lit up the entire cabin. Elliot flinched, his heart leaping into his throat. Lyra's eyes widened, and for the first time, He saw a flicker of fear in them. "They've found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's found you?" Elliot demanded, his fear giving way to a surge of adrenaline. "What's going on?" Lyra turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with urgency. "There are others who do not wish me to return home. They will stop at nothing to capture me. And if they find me here, they will not hesitate to harm you as well." Elliot's breath caught. "What? Why? What do they want with you?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window. "It is complicated, but you must trust me. We need to leave. Now." Elliot's mind reeled. Leave? In the middle of the storm? With an alien who might be lying to him? It was insane, reckless. But the look in Lyra's eyes told him she wasn't exaggerating the danger. He glanced at the window, where the rain continued to hammer against the glass, and then back at Lyra. "Where would we even go?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. "There is a place," Lyra said quickly. "A safe haven, not far from here. But we must move quickly. They will be here soon." Elliot's chest heaved as he tried to process everything. He felt like he was caught in a nightmare, one where every decision could mean life or death. But as he looked at Lyra, at the fear and desperation in her eyes, he realized he didn't have a choice. He couldn't just leave her here, not if what she said was true. "Okay," he said finally, his voice shaking. "Okay, let's go." Lyra nodded, relief flashing across her features. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will not forget this." Elliot grabbed his coat and a flashlight from the table, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the buttons. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but he knew he couldn't stay here, not with whatever or whoever was out there. As they stepped out into the storm, the wind and rain hit Elliot like a wall, soaking him to the bone within seconds. Lyra moved ahead of him, her form almost glowing in the darkness, her movements sure and steady despite the chaos around them. Elliot followed, his flashlight cutting through the rain as they made their way into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying violently in the wind. The ground was slick with mud, and Elliot slipped more than once, his heart racing as he struggled to keep up with Lyra. She moved with an almost supernatural grace, her silver skin glinting in the faint light of the flashlight. "How much farther?" Elliot shouted over the roar of the storm. "Not far," Lyra called back, her voice barely audible. "But we must hurry. They are close." As if on cue, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Elliot's spine. He froze, his flashlight darting around as he tried to locate the source of the sound. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra's eyes narrowed, her expression grim. "They are here," she said quietly. "Stay close to me." Before Elliot could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and menacing, its form obscured by the rain. It moved with a predatory grace, its eyes glowing a faint, sickly green. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as more figures appeared, surrounding them on all sides. Lyra stepped in front of Elliot, her body tense and ready. "Stay behind me," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the danger. Elliot's mind raced as he gripped the flashlight like a weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest that was about to unfold. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and rain, the trees twisting like skeletal fingers against the storm-ridden sky. Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled after Lyra, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. The flashlight in his hand flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the sheets of rain that seemed to fall in every direction at once. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. But it wasn't just the storm that made his heart race. It was the presence of the figures closing in around them, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness like malevolent stars. Lyra moved ahead of him, her silver form almost ethereal in the dim light. She seemed to glide over the uneven terrain, her movements fluid and precise, as if the storm and the forest were no obstacle to her. Elliot, on the other hand, felt like he was fighting against the very earth itself. His legs burned with the effort of keeping up, and his mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He didn't know who or what was chasing them, but the urgency in Lyra's voice had been enough to convince him that stopping wasn't an option. "Lyra," he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Where are we going? What are they?" She didn't answer immediately, her attention focused on the path ahead. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and tense. "They are hunters, sent to capture me. If they find us, they will not hesitate to kill you." Elliot's stomach churned at her words. "Why? What do they want with you?" Lyra hesitated, her luminous eyes flickering with something Elliot couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or guilt. "I cannot explain everything now," she said finally. "But you must trust me. We need to reach the safe haven. It is our only chance." Elliot wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the sound of snapping branches behind them cut him off. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. For a moment, he saw nothing but the rain and the shadows. Then a pair of glowing green eyes appeared, followed by another and another. The figures were closer now, their forms more distinct, tall, wiry, and covered in what looked like dark, scaly armor. They moved with a predatory grace, their movements synchronized and deliberate, like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. "Run!" Lyra shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. Elliot didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted after Lyra, his legs pumping as he pushed himself to keep up with her. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, the underbrush thicker. The rain made everything slippery, and Elliot nearly lost his footing more than once, his heart leaping into his throat each time. He could hear the hunters behind them, their low growls and the crunch of their footsteps growing louder with every passing second. Lyra suddenly veered to the left, leading them down a narrow path that Elliot hadn't even noticed. The trees here were so close together that their branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural canopy that blocked out most of the rain. The ground was softer here, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves, and Elliot's footsteps were muffled as he ran. But the hunters were still behind them, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like searchlights. "How much farther?" Elliot gasped, his lungs burning. "Not far," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. "But we must be careful. They are faster than they look." As if to prove her point, one of the hunters let out a guttural roar and lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. Elliot barely had time to react before the creature was on him, its clawed hands reaching for his throat. He swung the flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness as the heavy metal end connected with the hunter's head. The creature let out a pained screech and stumbled back, giving Elliot just enough time to scramble away. Lyra was at his side in an instant, her hand gripping his arm as she pulled him to his feet. "Come on," she urged, her voice filled with urgency. They ran again, the hunters hot on their heels. Elliot's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The creature's face, if it could even be called a face, had been a nightmarish blend of scales and sharp angles, its eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something intelligent and relentless. And it wanted them dead. The path ahead began to slope downward, the ground becoming more uneven as they descended into a narrow ravine. The sound of rushing water reached Elliot's ears, and he realized they were approaching a river. The rain had turned it into a raging torrent, the water churning and frothing as it crashed over rocks and fallen branches. Lyra skidded to a stop at the edge of the river, her eyes scanning the area quickly. "We need to cross," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Elliot stared at the rushing water, his stomach sinking. Are you serious? We'll never make it across that. We have no choice, Lyra replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. They will not follow us into the water. It is dangerous for them. Before Elliot could ask what she meant, the sound of the hunters' growls grew louder, and he turned to see them emerging from the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on him and Lyra. There were more of them now, at least a dozen, their forms silhouetted against the stormy sky. Lyra grabbed Elliot's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. Trust me, she said, her eyes locking with his. We can make it. Elliot hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he knew one thing for certain. Staying here meant death. Together, they stepped into the river, the icy water immediately soaking through his clothes and stealing his breath. The current was strong, pulling at his legs and threatening to sweep him off his feet, but Lyra held onto him tightly, her strength keeping him grounded. The hunters stopped at the edge of the river, their growls turning into frustrated snarls as they watched their prey slip away. Elliot didn't dare look back, his focus entirely on keeping his footing as they fought their way across the raging water. The river seemed to stretch on forever, the far bank a distant blur through the rain and darkness. But they made it. Somehow they made it. Elliot collapsed onto the muddy bank, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Lyra stood beside him, her silver skin glistening with water, her eyes scanning the opposite bank where the hunters still lingered. We're safe, she said softly, though her voice carried a note of caution. For now. Elliot looked up at her, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. What now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. Now, she said, we keep moving. The safe haven is close. But we must be careful. The hunters are not the only danger in these woods. Elliot's heart sank at her words, but he nodded, pushing himself to his feet. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The storm, the hunters, the river, it was all just the beginning. And whatever came next, he would have to face it with Lyra by his side. The far side of the river was quieter, the storm's fury muted by the dense canopy of trees that stretched overhead. Elliot's clothes clung to his skin, heavy with water, and every step felt like dragging weights through the mud. His body ached, his lungs burned, and his mind was a chaotic swirl of fear and exhaustion. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while the hunters were still out there, their glowing eyes haunting the edges of his thoughts. Lyra moved ahead of him, her silver form almost ghostly in the dim light filtering through the trees. She seemed unaffected by the cold, her movements as fluid and precise as ever, though Elliot noticed a faint tension in her shoulders, a subtle tightness in her voice when she spoke. She was worried, though she tried to hide it. That realization did little to ease Elliot's nerves. How much farther? He asked, his voice hoarse from the cold and the strain of running. Not far, Lyra replied, her tone calm but edged with urgency. But we must stay alert. The safe haven is protected, but the path to it is unpredictable. Elliot wanted to ask what she meant by unpredictable, but he didn't have the energy. Instead, he focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of danger. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots twisting out of the ground like the fingers of buried giants. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the occasional cry of a distant bird echoed through the stillness. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, though Elliot knew it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around them like a living maze. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made Elliot's heart skip a beat. He kept expecting the hunters to appear, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness, but they didn't. Not yet. Then, without warning, Lyra stopped, her body going rigid. Elliot nearly collided with her, his breath catching in his throat as he followed her gaze. Ahead of them, the forest seemed to shift, the trees bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The air grew colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the space around them, like the sound of a distant engine. "What is that?" Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the shifting trees, her expression unreadable. "We are close," she said finally. "But the safe haven is guarded. We must be careful." Elliot's stomach churned at her words. Guarded by what? Before Lyra could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low, rumbling vibration that sent shockwaves through Elliot's legs. He stumbled back, his heart racing as the trees ahead seemed to part, revealing a massive, glowing structure that pulsed with an otherworldly light. It was unlike anything Elliot had ever seen, a towering, crystalline formation that seemed to grow out of the earth itself, its surface covered in intricate patterns that shifted and changed as he watched. "What the hell is that?" Elliot breathed, his voice barely audible. "The safe haven," Lyra replied, her tone reverent. "But we must be quick. The Guardians will not allow us to enter unless we prove ourselves worthy." Elliot's mind reeled. "Guardians? Worthy? What are you talking about?" Lyra turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else, something that looked almost like regret. "There is no time to explain," she said. "Just stay close to me and do exactly as I say." Before Elliot could respond, the ground beneath them erupted, and a massive creature burst forth from the earth, its form a chaotic blend of stone and light. It was humanoid in shape, but impossibly large, its body covered in glowing runes that pulsed with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic energy. Its eyes were like twin suns, burning with an intensity that made Elliot's skin crawl. The creature let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the forest and shaking the trees. Elliot stumbled back, his legs giving out beneath him as he fell to the ground. Lyra stepped in front of him, her body glowing with a soft, silver light as she faced the creature. "We mean no harm," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We seek refuge." The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing as it studied her. For a moment, there was silence, the air thick with tension. Then, without warning, the creature lunged, its massive hand swinging toward Lyra with terrifying speed. Elliot's heart leapt into his throat as Lyra dodged the attack with impossible grace, her body moving like liquid light. She spun around, her hand glowing with a bright, silvery energy as she struck the creature's arm. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, and the creature roared in pain, its runes flickering erratically. "Elliot!" Lyra shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "Run to the safe haven. Now!" Elliot hesitated, his mind screaming at him to stay, to help her. But the creature was already recovering, its glowing eyes fixed on Lyra as it prepared to strike again. With a surge of adrenaline, Elliot pushed himself to his feet and bolted toward the crystalline structure, his legs moving on their own. The ground beneath him seemed to shift and twist, the trees closing in around him as if trying to block his path. He could hear the creature's roars and the sound of Lyra's movements behind him, but he didn't dare look back. His focus was entirely on the safe haven, its glowing light growing brighter with every step. As he reached the base of the structure, a wave of warmth washed over him, and the air seemed to hum with energy. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the crystalline walls parting like water to allow him entry. The interior was vast and cavernous, filled with a soft, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elliot turned back, his heart pounding as he searched for Lyra. She was still outside, her silver form darting and weaving around the creature's attacks. She moved with a grace and precision that was almost hypnotic, her every movement calculated and deliberate. But the creature was relentless, its massive fists slamming into the ground with enough force to send shockwaves through the earth. "Lyra!" Elliot shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "Come on!" Lyra glanced at him, her luminous eyes filled with determination. "Stay there," she called back. "I will handle this." Before Elliot could respond, the creature let out a deafening roar and charged at Lyra, its massive body moving with terrifying speed. Lyra stood her ground, her body glowing brighter as she raised her hands. A burst of silvery energy erupted from her palms, striking the creature square in the chest. The impact sent it stumbling back, its runes flickering and dimming as it let out a pained roar. Lyra didn't wait for it to recover. She turned and sprinted toward the safe haven, her movements a blur of light and motion. The creature roared in frustration, its massive hands reaching for her, but it was too late. Lyra crossed the threshold into the safe haven, the crystalline walls closing behind her just as the creature's fist slammed into the ground where she had been standing. Elliot let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed to the ground. Lyra stood beside him, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. Her silver skin was glowing faintly, and her luminous eyes were filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We made it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot looked up at her, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. "What now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Now," she said, "we rest. But we are not safe yet. The hunters will not stop until they find us. And the safe haven, it is not what it seems." Elliot's heart sank at her words, but he nodded. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The storm, the hunters, the guardians, it was all just the beginning. And whatever came next, he would have to face it with Lyra by his side. The interior of the safe haven was both breathtaking and unnerving. The walls, made of the same crystalline material as the exterior, pulsed faintly with a golden light that seemed to breathe in time with some unseen rhythm. The air was warm and carried a faint, sweet scent, like honey and wildflowers, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something metallic and sharp that made Elliot's skin prickle. The space was vast, the ceiling so high it disappeared in a shadow, and the floor beneath his feet was smooth and cool, like polished glass. Lyra stood a few paces away, her silver form glowing faintly in the golden light. She was still catching her breath, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, but her luminous eyes were alert, scanning the space around them with a cautious intensity. Elliot wanted to ask her 1,000 questions about the safe haven, about the guardians, about what would happen next, but the words caught in his throat. He was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to form coherent thoughts. "We can rest here," Lyra said finally, her voice soft, but carrying an edge of tension. "But not for long. The safe haven is unstable. It will not protect us indefinitely." Elliot frowned, his mind struggling to process her words. "Unstable? What does that mean?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze flickering to the walls around them. "This place exists between worlds," she explained. "It is a pocket of reality, created long ago by my kind as a refuge. But it is not meant to sustain life for extended periods. The longer we stay, the more it will unravel." Elliot's stomach churned at her words. "Unravel? Like fall apart?" Lyra nodded, her expression grim. "Yes, and when it does, we will be exposed. The hunters will find us, and we will not survive another encounter." Elliot swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So what do we do? How do we get out of here?" Lyra turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else, something that looked almost like regret. "There is a way," she said, "but it is dangerous, and it will require trust." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. "Trust? In what?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, She walked to the center of the room, where a large, circular platform rose slightly from the floor. The platform was covered in intricate patterns that glowed faintly, their light shifting and changing in a way that made Elliot's head spin. She placed her hand on the surface, and the patterns flared brighter, the light spreading outward like ripples on water. "This is a gateway," she said, her voice steady but carrying a note of caution. "It can take us to another place far from here, but it is not without risks. The journey is unpredictable, and there is no guarantee we will arrive where we intend to." Elliot stared at the platform, his mind racing. A gateway? To another place? It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, but after everything he'd seen, the hunters, the guardians, the safe haven itself, he couldn't dismiss it. Still, the thought of stepping onto that platform, of trusting Lyra to lead him through some kind of interdimensional portal, filled him with a deep, primal fear. "What happens if it goes wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost human. "I will not lie to you," she said. "If the gateway fails, we could be lost, trapped between worlds. Or worse." Elliot's chest tightened, and he felt a surge of panic rising in his throat. "And if we stay here? What happens then?" Lyra's gaze flickered to the walls around them, which seemed to pulse faintly, the golden light dimming ever so slightly. "The safe haven will collapse," she said simply, "and we will be at the mercy of the hunters." Elliot closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. He didn't know what to do. Every option seemed like a death sentence, but staying here, waiting for the safe haven to fall apart, felt like the worst choice of all. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down, and opened his eyes. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." Lyra nodded, her expression filled with a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked almost like gratitude. She stepped onto the platform, her silver form glowing brighter as the patterns beneath her feet flared to life. She held out her hand to Elliot, her luminous eyes locking with his. "Trust me," she said softly. Elliot hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand. Her skin was cool and smooth, like polished metal, but there was a warmth to it that surprised him. He stepped onto the platform, his heart pounding in his chest as the patterns beneath his feet began to glow brighter, the light spreading outward in a wave of golden energy. The air around them seemed to hum with power, the sound growing louder and more intense with every passing second. Elliot's vision blurred, the walls of the safe haven dissolving into a swirl of light and color. He felt a strange pulling sensation, like his body was being stretched and compressed at the same time, and his stomach lurched as the world around him seemed to tilt and spin. For a moment, there was nothing but light and sound, a chaotic whirlwind of energy that threatened to overwhelm him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped, and the world around him came back into focus. Elliot blinked, his vision slowly clearing as he took in his surroundings. They were no longer in the safe haven. Instead, they stood in a vast, open plain, the sky above them a deep, swirling purple streaked with gold. The ground beneath their feet was covered in a soft, silvery grass that shimmered faintly in the light of two suns hanging low on the horizon. In the distance, he could see towering structures that looked like a blend of crystal and metal, their surfaces reflecting the light in dazzling patterns. "Where are we?" Elliot asked, his voice trembling. Lyra turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked almost like sadness. "We are on my world," she said softly. "Or what remains of it." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. "Your world? What? How?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked a few paces ahead, her silver form glowing faintly in the strange light of the twin suns. "The gateway brought us here," she said finally, "but it is not what it once was. My world is dying, Elliot stared at her, his mind reeling. Dying? What do you mean? Lyra turned to him, her expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. There is much I have not told you, she said. But now that we are here, you deserve to know the truth. Elliot's chest tightened, and he felt a surge of fear rising in his throat. What truth? Lyra hesitated, her luminous eyes flickering with something Elliot couldn't quite place. The hunters, she said finally. They are not just after me. They are after something far more dangerous. And if they find it, it will mean the end of everything. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. What are you talking about? Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost human. I will explain everything, she said. But first, we must find shelter. The gateway's energy will have alerted the hunters to our presence. They will be coming. Elliot's heart sank at her words, but he nodded. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The storm, the hunters, the safe haven, it was all just the beginning. And whatever came next, he would have to face it with Lyra by his side. For a moment, there was nothing but light and sound, a chaotic whirlwind of energy that threatened to overwhelm him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped, and the world around him came back into focus. Elliot blinked, his vision slowly clearing as he took in his surroundings. They were no longer in the safe haven. Instead, they stood in a vast, open plain, the sky above them a deep, swirling purple streaked with gold. The ground beneath their feet was covered in a soft, silvery grass that shimmered faintly in the light of two suns hanging low on the horizon. In the distance, he could see towering structures that looked like a blend of crystal and metal, their surfaces reflecting the light in dazzling patterns. Where are we? Elliot asked, his voice trembling. Lyra turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked almost like sadness. We are on my world, she said softly. Or what remains of it. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. Your world? But how? Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked a few paces ahead, her silver form glowing faintly in the strange light of the twin suns. The gateway brought us here, she said finally. But it is not what it once was. My world. It is dying. Elliot stared at her, his mind reeling. Dying? What do you mean? Lyra turned to him, her expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. There is much I have not told you, she said. But now that we are here, you deserve to know the truth. Elliot's chest tightened, and he felt a surge of fear rising in his throat. What truth? Lyra hesitated, her luminous eyes flickering with something Elliot couldn't quite place. The hunters, she said finally. They are not just after me. They are after something far more dangerous. And if they find it, it will mean the end of everything. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. What are you talking about? Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost human. I will explain everything, she said. But first, we must find shelter. The gateway's energy will have alerted the hunters to our presence. They will be coming. Elliot's heart sank at her words, but he nodded. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The storm, the hunters, the safe haven, it was all just the beginning. And whatever came next, he would have to face it with Lyra by his side. For a long moment, there was only silence. Elliot sat in the center of the chamber, his body trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. Lyra was gone. The hunters were gone. The orb was destroyed. But at what cost? As the reality of it all sank in, Elliot felt a surge of grief and anger rising in his chest. He wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but there was no one left to answer him. He was alone, utterly and completely, in a world that was no longer his own. But as he sat there, his mind reeling, he noticed something strange. The walls of the chamber, once covered in intricate patterns of light, were now dark and lifeless. The air, once filled with the hum of energy, was now still and silent. And yet, there was something different, something that made his skin prickle and his heart race. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and walked to the entrance of the chamber. The world outside was no longer the same. The twin suns were gone, replaced by a single, familiar star. The silvery grass was gone, replaced by the familiar green of earth. And in the distance, he could see the outline of his cabin, its windows glowing faintly in the light of the rising sun. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he realized what had happened. The gateway had brought him home, but at what cost? As he walked toward the cabin, his mind filled with memories of Lyra, her luminous eyes, her silver form, her quiet strength. She had given everything to save him, to save his world. And though she was gone, he knew she would always be with him, in the stars, in the light, in the memories they had shared. He reached the cabin and stepped inside, the familiar scent of pine and damp filling his nostrils. The storm had passed, and the world outside was quiet and still. But inside, Elliot's heart was anything but still. He sat down on the threadbare rug in front of the fireplace, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had happened. The storm, the hunters, the safe haven, the orb, it all felt like a dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But he knew it was real. He knew Lyra was real. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light across the room, Elliot felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget Lyra. And though she was gone, her light would always guide him, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder of the strength and courage she had shown. Elliot closed his eyes, his heart heavy with grief, but filled with a quiet determination. He would honor her memory. He would live his life with the same courage and strength she had shown. And he would never forget the alien beauty who had crawled into his bed during the storm, her explanation making him blush, her sacrifice saving his world. As the sun's light filled the room, Elliot felt a faint, almost imperceptible warmth on his skin, like the touch of a hand. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought he heard her voice, soft and melodic, whispering in his ear. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." And then she was gone, her presence fading into the light, leaving Elliot alone but not forgotten, her memory a beacon in the darkness, a reminder of the strength and courage that lay within him. The storm had passed, but the light remained. And though Lyra was gone, her legacy would live on, a shining star in the vast expanse of the universe, a reminder of the beauty and strength that could be found in even the darkest of times. Elliot sat in silence, his heart heavy but filled with a quiet determination. He would honor her memory. He would live his life with the same courage and strength she had shown. And he would never forget the alien beauty who had changed his life forever. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light across the room, Elliot felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget Lyra. And though she was gone, her light would always guide him, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder of the strength and courage she had shown. Elliot closed his eyes, his heart heavy with grief, but filled with a quiet determination. He would honor her memory. He would live his life with the same courage and strength she had shown. And he would never forget the alien beauty who had crawled into his bed during the storm, her explanation making him blush, her sacrifice saving his world. As the sun's light filled the room, Elliot felt a faint, almost imperceptible warmth on his skin, like the touch of a hand. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought he heard her voice, soft and melodic, whispering in his ear. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." And then she was gone, her presence fading into the light, leaving Elliot alone but not forgotten, her memory a beacon in the darkness, a reminder of the strength and courage that lay within him. The storm had passed, but the light remained. And though Lyra was gone, her legacy would live on, a shining star in the vast expanse of the universe, a reminder of the beauty and strength that could be found in even the darkest of times.